The transport doctor called her just the flight nurse, the quiet woman who loaded the patients and handed him his instruments and rode the back of a regional air ambulance without ever saying much, and he laughed at the battered brass lighter she kept clipped to her lanyard. And not one person on that flight crew knew that the woman they had decided was a fixture. A pair of steady hands and nothing more had once kept the catastrophically wounded alive on the floor of a cargo bay, screaming through the dark over a war, while the rounds came up at them and the aircraft jinked, and the dying came aboard faster than there were hands, and that before that night on the mountain was over, she would be the only person still moving who could keep all of them, the doctor included, from freezing into the snow beside a burning wreck. Her name was Quinn Marsh, and most of the program called her Quinn, and the transport doctor, the fellowship, trained critical care physician who had come aboard for a long mountain transfer and had decided within 10 minutes of meeting her that a flight nurse in her early 40s at a small regional program was a glorified bag carrier and not a colleague, did not really call her anything at all. Because to him she was part of the aircraft, as ordinary as the litter rails or the oxygen bottles strapped to the bulkhead or the rotor wash that flattened the grass when they spun up. She was 40, 3 years old. She had been a nurse for 19 of those years, the last 6 of them on this air ambulance program that flew the critically ill and the badly broken out of small mountain hospitals and roadside wrecks and lonely ranches to the trauma centers down in the valley, an hour by air over country that took a day to cross by road. Working the long shifts, because the long shifts were hers and the work was honest and nobody had the energy to tell her how to do a job she had been doing, in one uniform or another, since before half of the program had finished their training. She moved through the hangar and the cabin the way deep cold water moves, slow and certain and easy to underestimate. And on the night everything changed, she was exactly where she always was at the start of a shift, in the bright fluorescent quiet of the crew room, clipping a battered brass windproof storm lighter on a beaded ball chain to her ID lanyard before she went out to check the aircraft. The lighter was old. The brass had gone soft and warm at the edges from years of being held, and the hinge was worn smooth, and clipped beside it on the same beaded chain was a small, dull coin, plain metal gone gray, the kind of thing a person is given and does not buy, though none of the program staff had ever looked closely enough to wonder what it was. She checked it the way some people check a watch when they are bracing for a long day, a flick of her thumb across the worn wheel. A small spark she did not light, and then she snapped the lanyard straight and squared her shoulders and went out across the dark apron to where the helicopter sat waiting under the floodlights with the mountains a black wall behind it. The crew chief had already pulled the cowlings and run the checks. The night was clear. For now. Down the valley, though, past the first ridge line, a line of cloud was stacking up against the peaks that Quinn did not like the look of, and she stood for a moment longer than she needed to on the apron, reading the sky the way she read everything, and then she went and found her seat in the back. Dr. Wade Calder was 51 years old and one of the better critical care physicians in the trauma center 200 miles down the valley, and he had not really wanted to be on this flight at all. He had agreed to ride along on a complex interfacility transfer as a favor and a teaching case, the kind of controlled, monitored, protocol-rich medicine he had built his whole reputation on. And he had come up to find a 4-seat aircraft and a single flight nurse and a pilot and a paramedic running the whole show out of a metal hangar at the edge of a mountain town, and he had filed all of it under the same heading within the first 10 minutes, which was beneath him. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He was something more ordinary and more dangerous, a skilled man who had spent 25 years being the most important person in every resuscitation room he entered, and had come to believe that the resources around a person were the same thing as the size of the person, and that a nurse on a little mountain helicopter was, by simple arithmetic, a nurse who had not been good enough to work anywhere that mattered. He looked at a flight nurse checking her kit by the red glow of the cabin light, with a battered brass lighter on a beaded chain around her neck, and he saw a person playing at medicine in a place where real medicine barely happened, and he felt, in the easy, weightless way you feel it about someone you have never once imagined being, a flicker of contempt dressed up as professional concern. You know they put a flashlight on every phone now and a fire extinguisher on the bulkhead right there, he said to her, 20 minutes into the wait for their patient, with a smile that was almost kind, nodding at the brass lighter on her chest. You don't need to carry your little camping toy around an aircraft, sweetheart. We're not exactly roasting marshmallows back here. And Quinn had looked down at the small brass thing on her lanyard and then back up at him, and she had said, "I know," and nothing else, and gone back to checking her kit, and he had taken her silence for the surrender of a woman who had no answer, when in fact it was the silence of a woman who had a great many answers and had simply learned, across 19 years, that the people who needed to tell her she was out of her depth were almost never the people who would listen if she told them why she was not. So she let it stand. She let nearly all of it stand. That was the thing about Quinn Marsh, that one night would teach them all at once. She did not need them to see her. She needed her patient stable and breathing, and her hands steady, and the lighter on her chest, though she could not always have told you why she still carried it after all these years, only that the day she stopped would be the day she would need it. If you have ever watched someone good get treated like they were nothing and felt that quiet anger that has nowhere to go, then you already understand why I tell these stories, and you already belong on this channel. Take 1 second to subscribe, because Unspoken Valor exists for exactly that feeling and exactly these people, the ones the room writes off, the ones who turn out to be the only thing holding the whole thing up when it starts to fall out of the sky. The folks who do are the ones who stay for the part where the world finally finds out who it has been ignoring, and that part is coming, and I do not want you to miss it. Because what happened to that little crew before the night was through is the kind of thing that if you had been strapped into the seat across from a quiet flight nurse, you would never have looked at one the same way again. There were 2 younger members of the crew who took their cue from the doctor the moment he came aboard, the way people always defer to the loudest credential in the room, a confident young flight paramedic named Cole Yates, and a brisk, quick young crew member named Priya Anand, both in their late 20s, both bright and capable, both good people who had simply been taught by the whole shape of their training to trust the title over the person and the protocol over the quiet woman who could not always quote them the year a guideline had changed. They were not bad. That is the part that matters, that the people who fell in behind the doctor and looked at Quinn Marsh with new doubt were not villains. They were just impressionable, in the specific way that smart young people are when a famous expert climbs into their small world and tells them, without quite saying it, that everything they had taken for granted was provincial. On most flights, on an ordinary transfer where the patient came aboard packaged and stable, and the weather held and the problems arrived tidy and slow, none of it cost anything at all. The aircraft flew, the patient was delivered, the flight nurse handled the back and was easy to defer past, and everyone was comfortable inside the arrangement, and nobody ever once imagined the engine going quiet over a mountain in a storm with no road for 40 miles. There was a third figure in the small theater of Quinn's working life that season, and she was not even aboard the aircraft, which somehow made her worse, because a person who can belittle you from 200 miles away through a radio and a quarterly report is a person with a long reach. Her name was Renata Vogel, and she was 48, and her title was something long and modern that came down, in the end, to numbers. She ran the air ambulance program's regional operations from an office in the valley, had never once ridden in the back of one of her own aircraft on a working night, and moved through her work like a woman reading a balance sheet that happened to be made of people and flight hours and insurance exposure. She had heard about the flight nurse at the mountain base who ran her own crash and survival drills alone on the empty tarmac at the slow hours of a shift, who had once asked, on a regional safety call, whether anyone had a real plan for a crew going down in the high country in winter, beyond the standard locator beacon and a prayer, and who had been told, with a small laugh, that this was a modern aeromedical program with redundant systems, not a survival school, and that she should focus on her core metrics. Renata Vogel did not find it charming. She found it a liability, because a nurse doing unscripted things in one of her aircraft was a variable she could not put in a column, and the columns were the whole of her religion. So she had begun, quietly, to build a file. She had the drills noted as unauthorized use of program facilities, the extra survival kit Quinn kept in her own flight bag as unapproved equipment outside the standard manifest, the brass lighter in an email, as a personal item creating a foreign object and fuel safety concern aboard the aircraft, a phrase she was rather proud of. And she had scheduled a formal conversation for the following week. And that very evening before the flight, when Dr. Calder had stepped out onto the apron and called the operations line to remark, half joking, that he was about to spend a long night in a tin can run by a nurse who carried a cigarette lighter and drilled for crashes that redundant aircraft did not have. Renata Vogel had listened with growing satisfaction, because here was a credentialed physician confirming everything her file already said. The write-up itself had come 3 days before, a printed sheet that a nervous junior coordinator had handed Quinn in person because Renata Vogel believed in a paper trail. It was a formal counseling notice, the first of her career, and it cited the drills and the extra kit and the trinket, and at the bottom there was a line for her to sign, acknowledging that she understood. She had set the paper down on the crew room counter. She had reached up, without quite deciding to, and her thumb had found the small worn coin clipped beside the lighter on her lanyard, and she had turned it over once, the way she always did when something was about to make a mistake, and the narration of her own life had gone very quiet in her chest. That coin was older than Renata Vogel's entire career. It had been pressed into her palm in the gray light of a forward strip at the end of the worst night of her life by a man with the smell of burning steel in his clothes and other people's blood dried brown to his sleeves, who had told her to keep it because people who do what she had just done do not get parades. They get to go home. And the coin is so you remember the ones who did not. The lighter had come from the same man, and she did not say any of that. She had looked at the coordinator's apologetic face and picked up the pen and signed the paper, because she had learned a long time ago that you do not waste your strength arguing with a system that is sure, and you save it for the night the system finds out whether you were right. What none of them knew, what was written in no file in this program or in Renata Vogel's office or anywhere a credential committee would ever look, was where Quinn Marsh had spent the 11 years before she had ever clocked in at a quiet mountain air ambulance base. She had worn a different uniform and answered to a call sign instead of a name, and she had been a combat trauma flight medic with a special operations medical element, which meant her ward had been the shuddering floor of an aircraft flying low through the dark over places that do not show up on the news, and her patients had been the most broken people a bad night downrange could produce. Lifted out under fire and handed up into her care, still bleeding, still burning, still fighting for breath, with the simple, terrible instruction to keep them alive until she could get them to a place with more. She had learned, out there, the thing that no classroom can teach and no protocol can hold, which is how to practice medicine in a machine that is moving and bucking and sometimes burning. In the cold and the noise and the dark, with the power stuttering and the wind screaming through a torn cabin and more dying than there were hands, how to look at a deck full of the catastrophically wounded and feel the panic rise in her own throat and set it down, deliberately, like a tool she could not use right now, and start sorting. She had learned that in a true mass casualty load, the most dangerous instinct a clinician has is the urge to pour everything into the first person they see, because the first person they see is rarely the one who will die in the next 10 minutes, and the whole grim art of it is to move past the loud to reach the silent. She had learned to work a wound by feel in total blackness, to make a fire and hold warmth in a place where the cold itself was trying to kill her patient as surely as the wound, to read weather and terrain the way other people read a chart, because in her old life, the weather and the terrain decided who lived. She had buried friends who never learned to move past the loud, and friends the cold took, and friends the random, stupid arithmetic of a bad night simply erased. And then, for reasons she kept folded up small and did not take out at work, she had come home for good, and traded the call sign for a name tag and taken the quietest, honest flying job she could find in the high country, and let everyone assume she had never done anything harder than load a stable patient and hand a doctor his instruments. There was one person on the crew who suspected there was more to her, and his name was Sam Boone, the pilot, a steady, broad-shouldered man in his 40s with close-cropped hair and an instinct for reading people that no one had ever put on his evaluation. Sam had flown with Quinn for 4 years, and in 4 years he had watched 100 small things the visiting doctors never noticed. He had watched her eyes go flat and calm in exactly the moments other people's went wide, watched her voice drop lower and slower when a case turned bad instead of climbing the way panic climbs, watched her hands stay perfectly still over a crashing patient while a brand new crew member shook. He had watched her glance, once, automatically, at the fuel state and the weather and the nearest flat ground every single time they crossed a stretch of country with no road, the way some people check their mirrors. He had watched her step off distances on the empty tarmac on slow nights, her lips moving, laying out where she would put the wounded and the gear if the aircraft ever came down hard, and he had never once asked her why. Because you did not ask Quinn things, you simply noticed that the answers were there, behind the quiet, and that they were not the answers a normal Ursum would explain. Once, a cocky new paramedic had rolled his eyes at Quinn's extra kit and her brass lighter and muttered something about the burned-out lifer who thought she was still at war, and Sam had taken him aside, very calmly, and told him to leave her be, that the day was coming when he would want to be sitting exactly where Quinn Marsh was sitting, and he had better hope she still bothered to teach him anything by then. The paramedic had laughed it off. Sam had not been joking. Their patient that night was a young man named Aaron Viello, 26 years old, and he was the reason the flight could not wait for the weather to make up its mind. He had been working alone on a ranch in a high valley when a tractor had rolled on him on a slope, and the small hospital in the nearest mountain town had done everything it could and then run out of everything it had, and what Aaron Viello needed now was a trauma center and a surgeon and a great deal of blood. And the only way to get him there in time was to fly him out over the range before the storm closed the passes. He came aboard packaged on a litter, pale and gray and barely holding, 2 units already running, a young man's whole life narrowed down to a set of failing numbers, and Quinn took him the way she took every patient, with a hand laid flat and easy on his shoulder, and her face calm and her voice low, telling him her name and that he was going to feel the aircraft move and that every minute of it was a minute closer to the people who could fix him. Dr. Calder ran the medicine of the transfer with brisk, real competence, and Quinn fed him what he needed, anticipated him, had the next thing in her hand before he asked, the way the best flight nurses do, and he took it all as his due and never once registered that the woman handing him the right thing at the right moment was reading the patient as fast and as well as he was. They lifted off a little after 9 into a sky that was still clear overhead and turned toward the pass, and for the first 20 minutes it was the smooth, droning dark of 100 ordinary flights, the patient holding, the doctor watching his monitor, Cole and Priya doing their jobs well, the lights of the mountain town falling away behind them, and then nothing below but the black shoulders of the range and the faint pale of snow on the high ground. Quinn worked her patient and watched her numbers and, every few minutes, without making anything of it, glanced out and forward at the weather, and what she saw she did not like. The line of cloud that had been stacking against the peaks had come up faster than the forecast, and it was lit now and then from inside by a flat pulse of lightning, and the air had begun very slightly to turn rough, the aircraft shrugging and settling in a way that made Cole grip his armrest and made Dr. Calder frown at his coffee. Up front, Sam Boone was talking quietly to the controllers and to the weather and to the aircraft, his voice in her headset calm and unhurried, telling her without telling her that he did not love it either, that he was looking at the pass and the cloud and the fuel and doing the arithmetic, and Quinn trusted Sam the way she had once trusted a very few pilots with her life, and she let him fly, and she flew her patient. The turbulence got worse as they came up toward the pass, the aircraft bucking now in earnest, the litter straining at its locks, the ivy line swinging, and Dr. Calder, who had spent his career in rooms that did not move, had gone quiet and a little gray himself, both hands braced, and Cole had stopped talking, and Priya was watching Quinn, because some animal part of her had already worked out who to watch. And Quinn, riding the bucking aircraft easily, one hand always on her patient, felt the first thin thread of the old feeling come up the back of her neck, the feeling she had hoped she would never feel again, the specific awareness of an aircraft and a sky that were no longer entirely friendly, and she did the thing she always did, which was to begin, quietly, without alarming anyone, to get ready. She checked that her flight bag was clipped down where she could reach it. She ran her eyes over the cabin and fixed in her mind exactly where everything was, the doors, the cutters, the kit, the bottles, the way she had fixed the layout of every aircraft she had ever flown in, once, automatically, so that she could find any of it in the dark. She tightened the patient's straps a notch. And she put her hand, for just a second, flat against the brass lighter on her chest, and felt its small familiar weight, and breathed out, slow, it was Sam's voice that told her, before any alarm did. She heard it change. Not panic, never panic. Sam did not have panic in him, but a new flatness, a new economy, the voice of a man whose hands had just gotten very busy, and he said in the headset the few clipped words that meant the night had just stopped being ordinary. There was a sound under the rotor beat that had not been there before, a roughness, a missing stair hitch in the engine note that Quinn felt in her teeth before she understood it, and the aircraft yawed, hard, and the cabin lights flickered, and a warning tone began somewhere up front, steady and awful, and Sam Boone's voice came through it level and fast, telling them the thing no one in the back ever wants to hear, that they had lost an engine, that he was looking for somewhere to put it down, that they were going down into the high country, and that everyone was to get into their positions and brace, now. And Quinn Marsh, in the half-second before the world came apart, did not freeze. She had felt an aircraft die under her before. She threw herself across her patient, wrapping the young man on the litter with her own body and arms the way she had been taught in a life no one on this crew knew about, tucking his head, taking the load onto herself, and she got out 3 words to the cabin in a voice that cut clean through the warning tone and the rising roar. The same 3 words she had used in a dying aircraft once before. The only thing there was time for brace, cover, now, and then the mountain came up to meet them out of the dark. If you've made it this far into Quinn's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Because up to now you have seen a competent woman swallow insult after insult and keep her dignity, and that is something, but it is not yet the thing. The thing is what happens in the next hour. On a snowbound ridge, with a burning wreck and a dead radio and the temperature falling, and a critical patient and an injured crew, when a famous critical care doctor and 2 confident young clinicians who have spent the whole evening certain of everything discover that all of it, the fellowships and the protocols and the famous hands, has abandoned them at once. And the only person on the mountain who knows what to do is the flight nurse the doctor wrote off for carrying an old brass lighter. There is no way you walk away from this story once you have seen what she does when the aircraft stops moving and the cold starts counting. The impact was not one thing but several, a long, tearing violence that went on far longer than it should have been able to. The aircraft coming down hard into a snow-covered slope, skidding and slewing and shedding pieces of itself. The world a roar of tearing metal and breaking, and the white blur of snow in the landing light. And then a last enormous lurch as it slammed into something solid and stopped, canted hard over on its side, and the roar fell away into a sudden ringing silence broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the moan of the wind, and somewhere a hiss that Quinn's body recognized before her mind did. She came back to herself, still wrapped around her patient, her ears ringing, a hot wire of pain down one side where she had taken the load, and she did the first thing 19 years and a hidden 11 had built into her, which was to ignore her own body entirely and take stock. The litter had held. Aaron Viello was still strapped down, still breathing, conscious enough to moan, and the simple fact that she had wrapped him and taken the impact onto herself was the first life she saved that night, before she had even gotten to her feet. And then she smelled it, sharp and unmistakable under the cold, and she heard the hiss resolve into the soft, hungry crackle that her nightmares were made of, and she saw through the shattered window above her, where the dark slope fell away, a flickering orange light beginning to climb. Fuel, A-line, had ruptured in the crash, and fuel was running down the canted belly of the wreck and finding something hot, and a fire was taking hold in the tail of the aircraft, in the cold, on a mountain, with all of them still inside it. There is a particular arithmetic that lives in the body of someone who has survived an aircraft fire, a clock that starts the instant the smell hits, and Quinn's clock started, and everything in her went, in a single breath, from injured woman to the calmest and most dangerous version of herself, the version this crew had never met, the version that the war had made and the mountain was about to need. The cabin was chaos in the flickering light. Calder was conscious, but stunned, hanging in his straps, blood running from a gash above his eye, his hands fumbling uselessly at his harness, his mouth opening and closing on words that would not come, a brilliant man whose entire expertise had just become irrelevant in the space of 9 seconds. Cole Yates was awake and panicking, fighting his straps, his voice climbing toward a scream. Priya Anand was slumped and dazed, a bad arm cradled against her but conscious. And up front, through the buckled gap where the cockpit had folded, Quinn could see Sam Boone. And Sam was not moving the way the others were moving. Sam was pinned, the structure come in around his legs, his face gray in the firelight, awake and calm and trapped. And the fire was climbing. Quinn did not waste a single second on fear, because she had spent her fear already years ago in worse places and learned to set it down. She got her own harness open and got her feet under her on the canted floor, and she used the first tool she had ever been given, the only one that works before any other, her own voice, raising it, but not in panic, in a flat, enormous command that cut clean through Cole's rising scream and stopped it dead. Listen to me. And something in the trained, absolute certainty of it, the complete absence of fear in a space drowning in it, made every conscious face turn toward her, the doctor and the paramedic and the dazed young crew member all at once, the way people in a burning building turn toward the one calm voice. We are getting out of this aircraft right now, this side, away from the fire, and then we are getting everyone clear, and then I will tell you what happens next. Cole, look at me. You are going to get that door open, and you are going to get out, and then you are going to take the people I hand you. Can you do that? And Cole, who a second before had been a man dissolving, grabbed onto the rope of her voice the way a drowning man grabs a rope, and said, Yeah, I can do that, and turned and got the door above them open to the cold and the dark, and the first thing Quinn Marsh did on that mountain was turn a panicking man into the first link of a chain. What happened in the next 4 minutes the crew would spend the rest of their lives remembering. Quinn ran the evacuation of a burning aircraft the way she had run it before, fast and exact and without a wasted motion, in an order that was not the order Panic would have chosen, but the order that kept the most people alive. She did not go for the patient first, though every instinct in the others screamed to, because the patient was strapped and stable for the moment, and the fire was still in the tail, and the ones who would die first were the ones who could not get themselves out. She got Priya moving, talking her through her own door, handing her up and out to Cole. She got to Dr. Calder and cut his fouled harness with the shears from her chest, rig in 2 quick motions, and put her shoulder under him, and half lifted, half walked the stunned doctor to the opening and pushed him up into Cole's hands, and the famous critical care physician went out of the burning wreck like a sack of feed, helpless, saved by the bag carrier. And then, with the fire's heat now pressing real and close against the back of the cabin, she turned to the 2 who could not simply be handed out, the trapped pilot and the strapped patient. And she did the brutal triage that only she on that mountain could have done, the arithmetic that decides who you reach for when you cannot reach for everyone at once. The patient first, this time, because the patient could be moved and the pilot, for the moment, could not, and because the fire would reach the litter before it reached the folded cockpit. She got the litter's locks open, fighting the canted angle, and she rigged a drag from the litter straps the way she had dragged wounded out of aircraft before, and she hauled Aaron Viello, litter and all, up the tilted floor toward the door with a strength that did not look like much until you saw it move a grown man and a litter uphill out of a burning machine, and Cole and Priya's good arm took the weight at the top, and they got him out and away, dragging the litter across the snow to where Dr. Calder sat stunned in the white. a safe distance from the wreck. And then Quinn Marsh turned back, alone, into a burning aircraft for the pilot, while the doctor who had mocked her watched from the snow with the firelight on his face and his expertise turned entirely to water in his hands. Sam was pinned, but he was clear-headed, and the two of them did, fast and wordless, the thing that people who have trained for the worst can do, which is to solve an impossible problem in the few seconds there are to solve it. The structure had come in across his lower legs, not crushing, but trapping, and the fire was perhaps 90 seconds away from reaching the spreading fuel beneath the cabin, and Quinn took it in at a glance and did not panic and did not freeze and did not try anything that would take too long. She found the bar, a length of torn structural member, and she used it as a lever the way Ray had once taught her to lever wreckage off a trapped man, getting a purchase, throwing her whole weight onto it, and the metal across Sam's legs groaned and gave perhaps 2 inches. And Sam, gray with pain, dragged one leg free, and then she reset the bar and threw her weight again, and he dragged the other free, and his legs were hurt badly, but they were his. And she got her shoulder under him, and the two of them came up and out of the door together and fell into the snow as the fire reached the fuel, and the back half of the aircraft went up with a soft, enormous roar that lit the whole ridge orange and threw their shadows long and black across the snow. And then they were all out, all 6 of them, alive in the snow, on a mountain, in the dark, with the wreck burning behind them and the storm closing over them and the cold already reaching into their wet clothes with its patient killing fingers, and the rescue, if any came, hours and hours away. And Quinn Marsh stood up in the firelight and looked at the situation with the flat, steady eyes of someone who had seen worse, and she understood the way none of the others yet did, that getting out of the aircraft had been the easy part, and that the mountain itself was now the enemy, and that the next several hours were going to ask of her every single thing the years no one knew about had taught her, and that if she got even one decision badly wrong, some of the people in this snow would not see the sun come up. The first thing the cold does on a mountain is make people stupid, and Quinn knew it, knew that every minute they stood stunned in the snow in their soaked clothes was a minute the cold stole from their brains and their hands, and so she did not let them stand. She turned to the firelit ring of shocked faces, and she began, in a voice that carried without shouting, to build a machine out of them, the way she had built machines out of frightened people in worse places, by giving each one a single clear job and the steadying knowledge that someone was holding the whole. "We are not going to die up here," she said, flat and certain, and the certainty in it was worth more than the words. People survive nights worse than this all the time, and they survive them by doing the right things in the right order. And I know the order. Everybody is going to get a job, and you are going to do your job, and we are going to be alive and warm when the sun comes up. Cole, you're with me. Priya, your arm is hurt, and I'll set it in a minute, but right now I need your eyes and your voice more than your hands, so you are on Aaron, you stay at his head, you keep talking to him, you tell me the second anything changes. Doctor, I'll get to you. Sam, don't you move those legs. And then she did the thing that decided everything. The thing not one other person in that snow would have known to do first, which was the fire. Not shelter, not the wounds, not the radio, the fire. Because on a mountain in winter, the cold is the fastest killer in the field, and warmth is not a comfort but a treatment, the first and most urgent treatment there was, and she had known it the instant the aircraft stopped moving. She moved them off the open snow into the lee of a low rock outcrop a little down the slope, out of the worst of the wind, and she sent Cole for anything that would burn and pulled apart a section of the wreck's interior paneling and broke dead branches from a stunted wind-bent tree, and she built, fast and expert, the kind of fire a person builds who has had to build fire to keep a patient alive, laid right, sheltered right, fed right. And then she reached up to her chest and she unclipped the battered brass windproof storm lighter from her lanyard, the camping toy, the trinket the doctor had laughed at 20 minutes and a lifetime ago. The personal item Renata Vogel had written up as a fuel safety concern, and she flicked the worn wheel with her cold thumb, and it caught the way it had always caught, a small, steady flame cupped against the screaming wind where 100 matches would have died, and she touched it to the tinder, and on a freezing mountain in the pitch dark. With the wreck's fuel fire already guttering out behind them into smoke and slag, Quinn Marsh made the only fire that was going to keep them alive. The light of it came up gold and alive in the lee of the rock, and she saw the understanding move across the firelit faces, the first crack in everything they had assumed about her, the dawning awareness that the woman they had pitied had just done. Without hesitation, and with an old worn tool she carried for exactly this, the single thing that was going to save their lives, and that she had carried the means to do it precisely because she had known, in a way none of them had, that a night like this was always possible. Cole looked at the lighter in her hand, and then at her face, and he did not say anything. But something in him had already begun to reorganize itself around her, the way water finds the low ground. And Dr. Calder, sitting in the snow with blood freezing on his face and his hands shaking, looked at the fire that the bag carrier had made and felt, for the first time in 25 years, the specific ground-tilting vertigo of a man whose entire expertise has just become the second most useful thing in the field, and he said nothing either, because there was nothing to say that would not have made it worse. Only when the fire was alive and built up did she turn to the wounds, and she turned to them in the order the wounds demanded, and not the order the loudest pain demanded, because that was the whole grim art of it. The worst was Aaron, of course the patient, whose failing was the failing he had come aboard with, made worse by the crash, the internal bleeding that had needed a surgeon 200 miles away, and now needed one more than ever, and could not have one for hours. She knelt over him in the firelight and read him in 3 seconds, the gray of him, the thin fast thread of his pulse, the way his belly had gone tight, and she understood with a cold clarity that she could not fix what was wrong with Aaron Viello on a mountain, that no one could, that the only thing that could save him was the trauma center, and the storm had put the trauma center out of reach. And so her job with Aaron became the hardest job there is, which is to fight a holding action against death itself, to buy a dying man hours he did not have with nothing but her hands and her wits and a fire, to keep him on the right side of the line by inches and minutes until help could reach him, knowing all the while that she might lose. She got his bleeding slowed the only ways the field allowed, got him insulated from the snow beneath him, which steals heat faster than the air ever can, got the fire's warmth onto him, got the last of the fluids running under her coat to keep them from freezing, and she settled into the long fight, and she put Priya at his head with the one job of keeping him talking and warm and telling her. The instant anything changed. Then Cole, who had a burn, a real one, across his forearm and the side of his hand where he had caught the heat getting the door open and never once mentioned it, because the young man had more in him than anyone had known, and Quinn caught it in the firelight and made him show her, and did not make a thing of it, just treated it, fast and right. The way you treat a burn when you have no manufactured burn dressings and no clean water to spare, covering it to hold the moisture and the warmth in, and the cold and the dirt off. the way she had improvised burn care in places with no shelves at all, and she taught him in 15 seconds how to keep it and when to tell her if it got worse, and she folded him back into the work. Then Priya's arm, which was broken, cleanly, below the elbow, and Quinn set it and splinted it against the cold with material cut from the wreck and the patient's spare blanket, fast and exact. And Priya bore it, with a flinch and a single sharp breath, and went back to her job at Aaron's head. And something in the brisk, confident young woman who had deferred to the doctor all evening had gone, quiet and serious, and changed. Then Sam, whose legs were the worst structural injury after Aaron, and whom she had told not to move, and she examined him by firelight with careful hands, and found one leg likely broken, and the other badly wrenched, but the circulation good in both, and she splinted and patted and insulated him where he lay, and got him off the snow, and got the fire's warmth to him. And Sam, who knew exactly what she was because he had spent 4 years quietly watching her, met her eyes while she worked and said, low enough that only she could hear it over the wind, "It's you, isn't it? The one Halverson always talks about, the one they tell stories about." And Quinn, working, did not answer, only gave him the smallest flicker of a look, and Sam nodded once to himself, the look of a man finally certain of a thing he had long suspected, and he said, "Okay, then we're going to be fine," and he meant it, because he had just understood that the most important fact about their situation was not the wreck or the cold or the storm. It was that the person in charge of the wreck and the cold and the storm was Quinn Marsh. And then, last, because his wound was real, but not yet dangerous, and because there was a far better use for him than as a patient, she turned to Dr. Calder, and this was the part that took a particular kind of nerve, because Wade Calder was one of the finest critical care physicians in the region, sitting in the snow with his expertise turned to ice. And a lesser person who needed the credit might have left him to flounder, might have taken a quiet satisfaction in the famous man's helplessness. Quinn did the opposite. She cleaned and closed the gash over his eye with quick, sure hands, and while she did it, she spoke to him low and fast and level, not as a nurse to a doctor, and not as a rescuer to a man who was drowning, but as one professional handing another the one job that would save him. And she said, "Doctor, listen to me. I need you to stop trying to figure out how to run a mountain, because you've never run one, and it will kill you and everyone else. And I have run worse than this. What I need from you is the thing nobody else here can do. You are the best medical mind on this slope by a mile, and I am going to be busy keeping us alive in ways that are not your training, so I need you to be my second brain on Aaron. You watch him, you think about him, you tell me what you'd reach for if we had a hospital, and between the two of us, we keep that kid breathing till the cavalry comes. You do what you're the best in the world at, the thinking, and let me do what I'm good at, the surviving, and we keep everybody. Can you do that?" And Dr. Calder, his face a war between affront and the dawning animal understanding that he was lost and she was not, looked at this flight nurse he had mocked an hour before, and something in him, some deep physician's honesty that had survived under all the pride, recognized the truth of every word, and he said, "Yes, yes, tell me what you see." And the machine was built. The radio was dead, and that was the next thing she dealt with, and she dealt with it without the despair that swallowed the others when they understood it. Cole had crawled back to the wreck at her direction and found the aircraft's radios smashed and silent in the crushed cockpit, and he had come back with his face falling, the realization landing on him that no one was coming because no one could be told where they were, and Quinn cut that despair off before it could spread. because despair is contagious in the cold, and it kills. "They know we went down," she said, evenly, building the fire up. Sam was talking to them the whole way. "They have our last position and our heading, and they will be looking the second this storm lifts enough to fly, and our whole job between now and then is to still be alive and to be easy to find. That's it. That's the entire mission. Stay alive, be findable. We can do both." And she set about making them findable the way she had once set about making downed people findable, methodically, without wasting hope on the things she could not control. She had Cole break out the locator beacon from the survival kit, her survival kit, the unapproved one, the extra gear Renata Vogel had written up, and set it going. She built the signal fire bigger and laid out spare wreckage and a torn high visibility panel where it could be seen from the air, and she kept the brass lighter clipped to her chest now, where her hand could find it, because the fire was the beacon, and the fire was the warmth, and the fire was, in every sense that mattered on that mountain, her. And then the storm, which had been threatening all night, finally came down on them in earnest, the way the high country does, the wind rising to a scream and the snow coming horizontal out of the dark, the temperature dropping further, the visibility closing to nothing, and the small gold world she had built in the lee of the rock began to fight for its life against the white roar trying to put it out. A lesser leader would have lost people in that hour. The cold and the wind and the dark are a kind of attrition, and they work on the body and the mind together, and Quinn knew the signs cold, the slurring and the stumbling and the strange calm that comes over a freezing person right before the end, the deadly thing where a hypothermic body starts to feel warm and wants only to lie down. And she watched her people for it the way she had watched casualties for the slow, quiet slide before, and twice that night she caught it early in someone and pulled them back. She caught it first in Priya, whose words at Aaron's head had started to thicken, and she got the young woman closer to the fire and got warmth into her, and warm words, and a harder job to keep her mind switched on, and pulled her back from the edge. She caught it later in Dr. Calder himself, the brilliant man going quiet and dreamy in the cold, and she was sharp with him, deliberately, made him angry, because anger is warm and dreaminess is death, and she got him moving and got him fed and got him back. She built them a shelter while the storm screamed, because the fire alone was not going to be enough against that wind, and she built it the way you build shelter when you have an aircraft's worth of wreckage and nothing else. Dragging panels and a door and torn structure into a low wall and a partial roof against the lee of the rock, angling it to throw the fire's heat back onto the wounded and break the wind. Insulating the ground beneath the patients with seat cushions and panel foam and anything that would hold a body up off the heat, stealing snow, and she did it fast and right while half explaining each piece of it to Cole so that he could become a second pair of skilled hands, and by the time the worst of the wind hit, there was a small, fierce, defended pocket of warmth on that mountain with 6 living people inside it. And it held. It held because she had built it to hold. It held because a long time ago, in a place she did not talk about, she had learned exactly how to build a thing that would hold against exactly this. The question came near the middle of the night, and it was Cole who finally said it out loud. Cole, who had panicked in the wreck and been turned into the steadiest of her helpers. And he said it not as a challenge, but with something close to awe, watching her work over Aaron in the firelight while the storm tore at their shelter. "Who are you?" he said. "I mean it. Where does a flight nurse learn to do this? To run a crash like that and build a fire in this and set a leg and call it all like it's a Tuesday?" I've worked this program 3 years and I've never seen anybody move the way you're moving. The doc froze. The doc froze and you didn't, not for 1 second. And you carry a lighter and a survival kit nobody else carries, like you've been waiting for this your whole life. Who are you? And Quinn, working, did not stop, and for a long moment over the wind it seemed she would not answer at all. And then she said, without looking up, in a flat, quiet voice, somebody who's done this before, in some hard places, with some good people. And that was all. And it was both nothing and everything. And Cole understood that he had wandered up to the edge of a thing she did not talk about. And he closed his mouth and gave a small nod and went back to the job. But the question hung in the firelit shelter now, where they could all feel it. The doctor and the pilot and the 2 young clinicians. The question of who exactly had been riding in the back of their aircraft all this time, and the night seemed to lean toward an answer it had not yet given. The supplies ran low, the way they always do, and she did not panic when they did, because she had simply never expected the mountain to be stocked. The manufactured dressings went first, and she improvised, the way she had in places with no shelves, clean torn cloth and panel plastic, and the patient's own blankets pressed into a dozen uses they were never made for. When the fuel for the fire ran short, she sent Cole and, later, Sam directing from where he lay, to scavenge more wreckage interior and more dead wood from the wind-bent trees, rationing the fire down to a fierce small core when the worst of the storm hit, and building it back up when it eased, managing warmth the way she had once managed oxygen and blood, as a finite treatment to be allocated to the ones who needed it most. The water she got from snow melted in a salvaged panel by the fire carefully, because eating snow cold steals the heat you cannot spare, another thing she knew that none of them did. And through all of it, she kept the holding action on Aaron going, checking him every few minutes, fighting for the dying young man by inches, and she did not let herself think about the surgeon 200 miles away, only about the next necessary thing, and the one after that. And the crew changed as the night ground on, the way people always change under someone who knows what they are doing. The fear that had owned them in the first minutes had been replaced, gradually, by something Quinn had watched take hold before in desperate places, a grim, competent calm that flows downhill from a calm commander. And the bright young clinicians who had frozen and panicked at the start were now moving with a hard new purpose, doing more and better work than they had ever done in their lives, because she had freed them from the impossible weight of deciding everything and given each of them one clear job and the steadying knowledge that someone above them was holding the whole. Cole had become her hands, learning fast, scavenging and building and tending the fire. Priya held Aaron's life at his head and never once let her attention drift. And Dr. Calder, the famous physician, had become exactly what she had asked him to be, a second brain on the patient, thinking hard about the failing young man and telling her what he saw, and finding, in being given that one good job, a way to be useful that did not require him to be the most important person in the field, which was a thing he had never in his life had to learn before and was learning now, in the snow, from a flight nurse. There was a moment, somewhere in the coldest hour before the light, when the whole thing nearly came apart, and it came apart not through any wound or any failure of hers, but through the simple human breaking of one of them under the weight of the night. Cole, exhausted and frightened and burned, sat back from the fire at one point and said, in a cracked voice, the thing that fear says, that they were going to die up here, that the storm was never going to lift, that no one was coming, that they should have, that they could have, the spiral that takes hold in the dark and pulls everyone down into it. And Quinn did not snap at him and did not coddle him. She looked at him across the fire, and she said, quietly, in a voice that carried under the wind, the truest thing she knew, the thing a man had once said to her on a worse night than this. You don't have to believe we're going to make it, Cole. You just have to do the next thing. Build the fire up. Then check on Sam. Then melt more water. That's all. You don't carry the whole night. Nobody can carry the whole night. You carry the next 5 minutes, and then the next 5, and you let me carry the rest, because carrying the rest is my job and I'm good at it. Just the next thing. Can you do the next thing? And Cole breathed and wiped his face and got up and built the fire up and did the next thing, and the spiral let go of him, and the shelter held, because she had held it the way she had held rooms full of breaking people before, with nothing but the next necessary thing, and a voice that was not afraid. The hardest hour came when Aaron crashed. It was deep in the night, the storm finally beginning to ease but the cold at its worst, and the young man on the litter, who had been holding by inches all night, began to slide, his pulse climbing and thinning, his color going from gray to something worse, his belly tight and his breathing shallow and fast, the body losing the long fight against the bleeding inside it that no one on that mountain could reach. Priya called it from his head, her voice sharp with fear, and Quinn was there in an instant, and Dr. Calder was there, and the two of them did everything that two skilled people with almost nothing can do. And for a few terrible minutes it was not enough, the young man sliding away under their hands toward the edge, and Quinn felt the thing she had felt before too many times, the specific cold dread of losing one you have fought all night for, and the part of her mind that was not needed for the work went, the way it always did when death came close, to Ray. Ray Okafor had been her chief and her teacher across the last 4 of her years downrange, a big, calm, unhurried man a decade older than her, a senior special operations medic who had taught her almost everything she knew that no book had ever held, and the two of them had kept the dying alive on the floors of shuddering aircraft 100 times, each more than once holding the other's nerve together when the cabin filled with smoke and the casualties came aboard faster than there were hands. It was Ray who had taught her to move past the loud to reach the silent, that the calm is a gift you give the people around you, and you get to choose which one you spread through a space. It was Ray who had taught her that on a cold night, the cold is a wound like any other, and warmth is a treatment you must give before all the rest. It was Ray who, on the night an aircraft went down hard on a frozen ridge in another country, and the survivors were scattered and freezing in the dark. The same cold, the same impossible arithmetic, had crawled through the wreckage beside her and done with her the slow, exact, desperate work that keeps people alive on a mountain until the dawn and the lift can come. And most of them had lived, and the two of them had come down off that ridge in a gray, frozen dawn, filthy and shaking and alive, and Ray had pressed a small, dull challenge coin into her hand, one of his own, worn smooth, and told her to keep it, that people who do what they had just done do not get parades, they get to go home, and the coin is so you remember the ones who did not. And he had unclipped the battered brass windproof storm lighter from his own kit, the one he had carried for 20 years, and pressed that into her hand too, and told her that on the worst nights, the cold ones, the dark ones, the ones where the dying came faster than there were hands, and she did not think she had it in her to start the fire one more time. All she ever had to do was remember that the fire was the whole of it, that warmth and light were the first medicine and the last hope, and that as long as she could make a flame, she could keep people alive, and as long as she could keep people alive, she had not lost, and that the lighter would always make a flame, in any wind, on any mountain if she only kept it close and trusted it, and took the next breath and lit the next fire, and that was how you got everyone home alive, one flame at a time. 11 months after that, on an ordinary lift on an ordinary gray morning, in the stupid random way the world takes its best people, Ray Okafor had not gotten to go home. And Quinn had carried the coin and the lighter every single day since. Through the leaving of that life and the long, quiet years in the high country, a man's whole legacy worn smooth against her chest, and she had never once told a soul at the program that the trinket the doctor mocked and the administrator wrote her up for was the only grave she had. He had left her a letter, too. She had not been there when he died. And afterwards, someone had handed her an envelope with her name on it in his blunt, careful hand. The kind of letter the people in that work sometimes write and leave with their things against the day the random morning comes. And she had carried that folded letter in the inside pocket of every jacket she had owned since, soft now and worn nearly through at the creases. And she had read it so many times that she did not need to unfold it to hear it. It was short. It was not sentimental, because he had not been. It said that if she was reading it then it had happened, and that she was not to carry it, the weight of the ones they could not save, because she had carried more than her share and saved more lives than anyone would ever write down. It said that the work was never the parades, that the work was the next person, always and only the next person, the one in front of you right now who could still be saved, and the next flame, the one that kept them warm enough to reach. And it ended with a line she heard now, kneeling in the snow over a dying young man with the firelight on her hands and the cold pressing in. The line about the fire, that as long as she could make a flame she had not lost, that all she ever had to do was keep it close and trust it and light the next one and take the next breath and reach for the next person who could still be saved. And then the one after that, and that was the whole of it. That was how you carried it, one flame at a time until the gray dawn came and the lift came and the sun was there. She breathed out. She did the next necessary thing. And then the one after that. She did not get to fix what was wrong inside Aaron Viello, because no one could have. Not there. But she did the thing that was hers to do, which was to refuse to let him go 1 minute before she had to. And she and Calder worked him with everything they had, and she got the fire's warmth driven harder into him because she knew, the way Calder was only now learning, that a cold body cannot fight, and that warming him was as much a part of saving him as anything else, and she held the line, and held it, and held it. And somewhere in that holding the young man's slide slowed, and steadied, and stopped. And he came back from the very edge, not saved, not safe, but alive, still alive, bought another hour, and then another, on nothing but 2 pairs of skilled hands and a fire made with a dead man's lighter. And Dr. Calder, sitting back on his heels in the snow with the dawn still hours away, looked at the flight nurse who had just dragged a man back from a death the doctor had been sure of, and he said, very quietly, the thing he had been circling all night. "Where did you learn to do this?" Not a challenge now. A real question, almost lost under the easing wind, and Quinn, already checking the next thing, said later, "Help me keep him warm." The cold still trying to take him. And the question stayed in him, a small stone dropped into a deep well falling. Not everyone on a mountain comes back. And it has to be said because the story would be a lie without it, that there was a long stretch in that coldest hour when Quinn was not at all sure she would get all 6 of them down alive, when she did the terrible private arithmetic she had carried since her first war, ranking in the cold, honest back of her mind who was strongest and who was failing and what she would do, what she would have to do if it came to choices. And she did not flinch from holding those numbers even as she fought with everything in her to never have to use them. That was the cost she had paid for long ago and carried in the coin on her chest. The knowledge that survival is not always about saving everyone, because everyone cannot always be saved. It is about saving the most, and that the person willing to hold that arithmetic in the cold, in the dark, while everyone else looks away from it, is the most important and the loneliest person on the mountain. She held it. She used every scrap of it to keep from ever having to spend it. And by the grace of the easing storm and the fire she had made and the work she had done, the dawn began at last to come, and all 6 of them were still breathing when it did. The light came up gray and then pale gold over the eastern peaks, and the wind dropped away to almost nothing, and the snow stopped, and the world that had been a screaming white dark all night resolved into a still and brutal and beautiful place. A high snowbound ridge under a clearing sky, the burned-out wreck a black smear on the white a little above them, and the small, fierce, defended pocket of life she had built holding steady in the lee of the rock, the fire still burning, all 6 of them alive inside it. And Quinn, who had not slept and had not stopped and had carried the whole night on her own back, did not allow herself to feel any of it yet. Because the dawn was not the end. The dawn was only the thing that made the lift possible, and her job now was to get them found and get them off the mountain. And she built the signal fire up high and put the last of the green wood on it to throw smoke into the still morning air, a gray column rising straight up off the ridge now that the wind had died. The oldest signal there is, here, here. The living are here. She heard it before any of them did, because it was a sound her body had been built around for 11 years. The deep rhythmic beat of rotor blades coming up the valley low and steady in the still morning air, an aircraft flying a search pattern, and she had Cole and Priya up and waving the high visibility panel, and she fed the smoke higher. And the beat of the rotors changed, swung, steadied, came toward them, and a helicopter rose over the shoulder of the ridge into the gold morning light and tipped its nose at them in the way that means we see you. And Quinn Marsh stood in the snow with the firelight and the dawn on her face and let herself feel, for exactly one breath, the thing she had not let herself feel all night, which was that she had done it, that she had held the whole night against the mountain and the cold and the dark, and she had not lost a single one of them, and then she put it away again, because there was work to do. The aircraft could not land on the steep snow, and so it put a team down on a hoist, figures dropping out of the morning sky on a wire onto the ridge. A high-altitude search and rescue team, alpine specialists in plain, unmarked rescue shells and harnesses, moving with the particular economical urgency of people who do this for a living, and they came across the snow toward the survivors fast, and the senior of them, the team leader, reached the little defended pocket of life first and stopped, as everyone who came upon Quinn's work that night and morning stopped. At the sheer overwhelming sight of it. He was a weathered man in his 50s, gray at the temples, calm in the specific bone-deep way that only people who have done this kind of work for 30 years are calm, and he came into the lee of the rock and took it in with the eye of a man who has reached a great many crash sites in the high country and knows in an instant the difference between a site where people survived by luck and a site where people survived because someone ran it. And what he saw made his eyebrows go up, because most of them are a horror, and this one, for all the wreck and the cold and the long night written on every exhausted face, bore the unmistakable fingerprints of someone who had run it by a doctrine he recognized in his own spine. He saw the fire built and sited exactly right, the shelter angled to throw the heat, the patients insulated up off the snow, the burns dressed and the fractures splinted with field improvisations. The critical man still alive against all reason, with lines running under a coat to keep them from freezing, the signal laid out, the beacon going, the whole impossible thing held together through a mountain winter night by someone who had clearly done this somewhere there were no shelves and the cold was trying to kill them, and he began, frowning slightly, to look around for the person who had to be responsible, expecting, maybe, a survival instructor who happened to be aboard, and his eye traveled across the exhausted crew and snagged and stopped on a woman in a plain Navy flight medic jacket with a battered brass lighter on a beaded chain around her neck. He went very still. The morning, which had been all motion and rotor noise and urgency, seemed to the people in it to slow around the two of them, though nothing actually slowed. It only felt that way afterward in the telling. He took a step toward her, and another, his eyes moving over her the way a man's eyes move when he is matching a face in front of him against a face from a long time ago, from another life, from the hardest and most important days of his own service. He took in the worn brass lighter on the beaded chain at her chest, the soft warm brass and the smooth hinge, the small dull coin clipped beside it. And his weathered face did something complicated, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud, but the morning had gone quiet enough by then to hear it, every crew member and every rescuer, the doctor with the dried blood on his face, and the two young clinicians she had forged into a team, and the pilot she had pulled from the fire, all of them watching this strange, slow recognition unfold without yet understanding it. "I know you," he said. And Quinn, who had not stopped working, who had a hand on Aaron's litter and was already half turning to brief the team on her patient, went still in her turn and looked at him, really looked, and the crew watched something cross her own face. Recognition answering recognition across a span of years and a long way from here. "I know you," the old rescuer said again, and he came the last few steps to her, and he said a word that no one on that crew had ever heard, a word that was not Quinn, and was not Marsh, and was not nurse, a call sign, two clipped syllables, the name she had answered to in the shuddering aircraft she did not talk about. And he said it the way you say a name you were sure you would never get to say to its owner again. "Vesper," he said. And Quinn Marsh, after a long moment, gave the smallest nod, which was its own kind of answer. "I came up after your time," the team leader said, and now he was speaking half to her and half, without quite meaning to the stunned and silent crew, because he was a man who understood instinctively that a wrong was being righted in front of him and that it needed witnesses. Different service, but the community's small, and everybody who does cold weather casualty work. Everybody who does aircraft recovery in the high country, we learned it from the people who wrote it, and there was a flight medic, before my time, ran the worst nights anybody worked, brought back people off frozen ground that nobody had any business bringing back, taught half the instructors who taught me. Vesper, they still teach the Ridge Protocol that Medic wrote, the night of the downed aircraft, the scattered survivors, the cold. I have taught it myself. I never thought I'd," and he stopped, because Quinn's eyes had moved just once to the brass lighter at her chest and back, and the old rescuer was a man who knew exactly what that meant, and he looked at the coin beside it and understood that there was a name in this that had not come home, and he let it go unsaid the way you do. He looked around the wrecked frozen ridge at the 6 living people in the lee of the rock where there had every right to be fewer, and he understood precisely who had done it, and he looked back at her, And the next thing he did slowly and deliberately and entirely on purpose, in front of all of them. The old rescue team leader came to attention, this gray, weathered man who had pulled the living and the dead off 100 mountains and bowed to no one, and he brought his hand up in a slow, precise, unmistakable salute and held it to a flight nurse in a smoke-smudged jacket on a frozen ridge and said quietly, "Ma'am, it is an honor to finally put a face to that call sign. I have been teaching what you wrote my whole career, and I never thought I'd get to stand on a mountain you'd held." And the crew understood. All at once, the doctor who had mocked her lighter, and the young clinicians who had deferred past her, and 200 miles away in an office she would walk back into, the administrator who had built a file on her. Every one of them understood at the same instant exactly who had been riding in the back of their aircraft all season, exactly whose hands had been on them all night, exactly what the trinket was that the doctor had laughed at and the policy had forbidden. The woman the program had decided was the least important person on the crew was, and had been all along, the most. And not one of them, in that moment, could find a single thing to say. Quinn did not enjoy it. That is the part that mattered most about her, and it would have disappointed anyone hoping for a scene of triumph. She did not draw herself up. She did not look at Calder or let a single flicker of vindication cross her face. She looked, for a moment, deeply and simply tired, the tiredness of someone who has carried a great weight a very long way and has just had it acknowledged and finds that the acknowledgement does not make the weight 1 ounce lighter, only a little less lonely. And then she did the only thing she knew how to do. She returned the old rescuer's salute with a small nod, equal to equal. That said more than any speech could have, and turned back to her patient, because there was still a dying young man who needed to be on that aircraft and a crew to get off the mountain, and she said, in the same flat, steady voice she had used all night, "He's a critical abdominal trauma. He's been crashing and I've been holding him. He needs to be the first one out, and he needs a trauma center, not the nearest pad. Let's package him right and not lose him on the way down." And the spell broke, and the morning came back into motion, and the work went on. But it went on differently now, because everything had changed, and every soul on that ridge knew it. They got Aaron Viello off the mountain first, hoisted up into the rescue aircraft with Quinn's improvised lines still running and her field notes going with him, and they flew him to the trauma center she had been fighting to reach for him all night, and the surgeons there did what only they could do, and it was close. Closer than anyone wanted, but the young man lived, and the reason he lived, every doctor who reviewed it afterward agreed, was that someone had kept him alive on a freezing ridge through a night that should have killed him 3 times over, had bought him the hours he did not have with nothing but 2 pairs of hands and a fire, and had refused again and again to let the cold take what the bleeding had not. They did not, in the official record, have a word for what that someone had done. The people who studied it later would struggle to explain the survival numbers off that ridge without using the word the program's own files did not contain, which was that on the night the medevac went down in the high country, that little crew had, by pure accident, been carried by one of the finest combat trauma flight medics alive. Dr. Calder found her at the trauma center 2 days later, when the criticals were stable and the crew was being checked over and the long, slow exhale of a survived disaster had begun. He looked older than he had on the apron that night, and humbler, in the way men are humbled not by being beaten, but by being shown the true size of something they had been too small to see, and he did not make excuses, which was the one decent thing left for him to do, and he did it. "I was wrong about you," he said. "From the minute I got on that aircraft, and I said things, and I want you to know that I know it." He stopped, and then he said the thing that cost him the most. "When we went down, I froze. I had no idea what to do, none, and you knew exactly what to do every second, and you pulled me out of a burning helicopter, and you built a fire that kept me alive, and you gave me the one job I could still be good at, and you never once made me feel it. I have been doing this 25 years, and I have never seen anything like what you did on that mountain." And Quinn looked at him, and there was no cruelty in her, none at all, and she said, simply, "You did good work up there, once you had room to. Your read on that kid's bleeding was right, and you helped me hold him, and that mattered. You're a fine doctor, Wade." And then, because the work was always the only point, she added, quietly, "If you want to thank me, help me make the next one go better. Aircraft come down. They always have and they always will, and the only thing between a crew and the dark cannot be one nurse who happened to be aboard. Let me run my drills on the clock with the crews, so everybody knows what to do when the engine quits over the high country." And Calder, who the night before the crash had offered to show her where the fire extinguisher was, said, "Yes, God, yes, teach all of us. Start with me." Renata Vogel never quite apologized. People like Renata Vogel rarely do, because the apology would require them to take apart the entire structure by which they understand their own importance. But something in her had shifted all the same, and it showed in the only language she had. The counseling notice disappeared from Quinn's file. No one ever saw her remove it, but it was simply gone, as though it had never been written. The drills were approved a few weeks later as a new program, Wilderness Survival and Crash Survivability Initiative for the region's mountain bases, written up in her careful institutional language as though it had been her own idea from the start, which Quinn let her have without a flicker, because she did not care whose idea the world believed it was, only that the crews would be ready when the next aircraft came down. The extra survival kit she had been written up for carrying became quietly standard equipment on every aircraft in the program, and months later, when an industry review held that small mountain program up as a model of crash survival and aeromedical safety, it was Renata Vogel who stood at the front of a bright conference room and accepted the recognition on behalf of the program, and she did not say Quinn Marsh's name, and Quinn, sitting in the back in her plain navy jacket, did not mind, because she had stopped needing her name said out loud a long time ago, in places where no names were ever said at all. The people who mattered knew. That was enough. It had always been enough. The two young ones were never the same after that night, and that, more than any salute, was the thing Quinn would have called the real reward. Cole Yates, who had panicked in the wreck and then become the steadiest pair of hands she had, became her most relentless student, turning up for every drill. Asking the questions she could see cost him his pride, and he would become a genuinely fine flight medic, the kind who stays calm when an aircraft goes quiet, and he would tell the story, when he taught the ones who came after him, of the night a flight nurse pulled a whole crew out of a burning wreck and held them alive on a frozen ridge with a dead man's lighter. And he would always end it the same way, by telling them that the most important person in any crew is almost never the one with the most letters after their name. And Priya Anand, who had held Aaron's life at his head all night through her own broken arm and a hypothermia she had not even felt creeping up on her, never again confused her training for the whole of the job, and she became the one with the real gift for the bad nights, the one who could walk into a disaster and keep her head, and she had learned it in a single night on a mountain from the woman who had taught her, the hard way, that you carry the next 5 minutes, and you let the cold carry nothing. Sam Boone healed slow, the legs taking months and metal and a long, hard road, but he flew again. And the first crew he asked for when he came back was Quinn's, and the two of them never once spoke of that night directly. But something settled between them that had not needed words before, and needed them even less now. Sam simply started doing the walk around with her every shift. The two of them out on the dark apron together, checking the aircraft before the others arrived. The small, mundane ritual of one person telling another that they are seen, and Quinn did the walk around with him, and that was the whole of the conversation. And it was complete. And the cocky young paramedic who had once called her the burned-out lifer, who thought she was still at war, heard the story secondhand and came back through a season later and could not quite meet her eyes and mumbled that he was sorry, that he hadn't known. And Quinn told him what she always told the ones who had underestimated her and lived to learn better, that it was all right, that nobody ever knows what anybody else has carried, and that the only thing that matters is what you do the next time you are wrong about someone. Aaron Viello came back too. It took months and surgeries and a long, hard road, but he walked, and one afternoon the following autumn, when the high country had gone gold and cold, he came out to the mountain base on a pair of unsteady legs and a great deal of stubbornness to find the nurse who had wrapped him in her own body when the aircraft hit and held him on the right side of the line all night on a freezing ridge. He found her in the hangar, of course, and he did not make a speech. Because she was not a woman who would have known what to do with one, he just stood there a moment and then said, "Thank you for not letting go." And Quinn, who had held the hands of more frightened people than she could count across half the world, felt something move in her that she did not let show. And she told him to sit down before he fell down and check the color of his hands out of pure habit, 2 steady fingers on his wrist, and told him he was healing well, and he was. He asked her before he left where she had learned to do what she did, and this time she gave him a little more of the answer than usual. She told him she had learned it in some hard, cold places a long way from here, from some good people, most of whom had not gotten to come home, and that bringing him home had been, in a way he would never fully understand, a way of bringing a small piece of them home, too. He did not press. He was, by then, someone who understood that some things are carried and not explained. And he went back out into his second life, the one she had given him. It is worth asking, before the story closes, why a person like Quinn Marsh chooses the quiet at all, why someone who had run the worst nights in the worst places would instead take the most invisible seat on a small mountain crew, and let a woman like Renata Vogel build a file on her for a season without once setting her straight. The easy answer, the wrong one, is that she was broken, that the years downrange had hollowed her out, and the back of a quiet helicopter was where the hollow people go to hide. But that was not it, and Sam, who watched her closest, knew it was not it. Quinn had spent 11 years where every day might be the worst day of someone's life, and she had learned out there exactly what she was capable of and exactly what it cost, and she had decided, when she came home for good, with Ray's coin in her pocket and his letter folded over her heart, that she did not need the world to keep telling her she was extraordinary. She knew what she was. She had nothing left to prove to anyone, which is the rarest and most dangerous kind of freedom a person can have, because it cannot be taken and it cannot be bought, and it makes you serenely unbothered by the Calders and the Vogels of the world, who run on exactly the opposite fuel, on the endless need to be told that they matter. She had chosen the quiet because the work was honest and the need was real. And on almost every flight, some frightened, hurting person came aboard, and she got to be the steady hand that met them, and that to her was not one step down from the worst nights of her old life. It was those nights distilled to their purest form, the next necessary thing. One person at a time, no parades, no podium, just the work and the deep, quiet satisfaction of being exactly where she was needed, unseen and entirely herself. There is a thing the people who run the world by titles never understand about the people who run it by competence, and it should be said plainly before the end. The titled Believe recognition is the point, that the salute and the plaque and the name said out loud are the reward the work is paid in, and so they cannot comprehend a person who does the work without needing the pay. And they mistake that person's silence for the silence of someone with nothing to say, when it is, in fact, the silence of someone who already holds everything that matters. The systems we build to sort the important from the unimportant, the letters after the name, the title on the flight suit, the equipment approved by the committee, are useful most of the time. On the ordinary flights when the patient comes aboard stable and the weather holds. But they are only a map of the truth, and like every map, they are wrong in exactly the places that matter most. And the night the engine quits over the mountains, the night the storm puts you down on a frozen ridge with the dark coming on, the map fails, and all that is left is the territory. And in the territory, the only thing that has ever mattered is whether the person beside you knows what to do, whether they will keep their head when everyone else loses theirs, whether they will build the fire and hold the line and carry the terrible arithmetic until the sun comes up over the peaks. Titles cannot do that. Only people can do that, and the people who can are almost never the people the crew has decided to look at. A few weeks after the night of the crash, on an ordinary evening before an ordinary shift, Quinn Marsh sat alone for a while in the quiet of the empty crew room as the last of the day's cold gold light came slanting low off the peaks through the window and lay across the table. She had a soft cloth in her hands and the battered brass storm lighter on the table in front of her, off her lanyard for once, and she was cleaning it slowly, the way she did every so often, working the cloth into the worn seam of the case and along the beaded chain, gone smooth from 19 years of long days, and beside it on the table sat the small, dull challenge coin. And beside that, unfolded, soft and worn nearly through at the creases, sat the letter. She did not need to read it. She knew every word of it by heart. But she read it anyway, the way you visit a grave, the blunt, careful handwriting of a big, calm, unhurried man who had taught her to move past the loud to reach the silent, who had taught her that the fire is the whole of it, and who had not, himself, gotten to go home. The work was the next person, always and only the next person. As long as you can make a flame you have not lost, keep it close and trust it, and light the next one and take the next breath and reach for the next person who can still be saved, and then the one after that, and that is the whole of it. That is how you carry it, one flame at a time, until the gray dawn comes, and the lift comes, and the sun is there. She sat with it as the gold light faded toward dusk, 43 years old, 19 of those years spent with her hands inside other people's worst days, and she let herself feel, for a few minutes, the full weight of all of it. Ray and the coin and the frozen ridge in another country and the mountain in this one and the cold and the fire and the young man with the unsteady legs who had walked back in to say thank you for not letting go. And then, the way she had learned to, she set it down. She folded the letter along its soft creases and slid it back into the inside pocket over her heart and picked up the small dull coin and turned it over once and clipped it back onto the beaded chain. And then she picked up the battered brass storm lighter, the camping toy, the little gadget she did not need, the only grave she had, and clipped it back onto the chain beside the coin where it belonged, and flicked the worn wheel once, and watched the small, steady flame stand up against nothing, the way it always did, the way it always would. And she closed it and snapped the lanyard straight and squared her shoulders and stood up because it was almost time to check the aircraft. And somewhere out beyond the hangar doors, the ordinary evening of a mountain town was already coming in. The rolled tractors and the chest pains and the long transfers down the valley, the gentle catalog of human trouble, and on almost every night, that was all it would ever be. But she would carry the lighter anyway. She would always carry the lighter. Because the day she stopped carrying it would be the day she needed it, and because somewhere a man had once told her that people who do what she did do not get parades, they get to go home, and going home, for Quinn Marsh, had always meant going back out to the dark apron and the waiting aircraft and being the calm in the cabin, unseen and steady and ready for the next one and the one after that. So here is what I will leave you with, the question I have been turning over since I first heard this story. The next time you are in a room or a crew or a life full of credentials and confidence, full of the people the world has lifted up and the systems everyone has been taught to trust, and something begins, quietly, to go wrong, who are you going to be? Are you going to be one of the ones who keeps trusting the title and the protocol and the loudest voice right up until the moment all of it fails at once? Or are you going to be the one who looks for the quiet, competent soul at the edge of it, the steady pair of hands everyone else has written off, and asks her what she sees and learns, the way a whole crew learned on a frozen ridge in the high country, that the most important person in the room is almost never the one the room has decided it is. Competence does not announce itself, and the quietest hands on the crew are so often the ones holding it up. That was tonight's story from Unspoken Valor. Some heroes never ask to be seen, but they're always worth the salute.